I wish I was as sure you were going to enjoy me as much as you did. My name is Gary, and I am an alcoholic.
Hey, Gary.
Hi. I just am amazed. There's so much he said that I haven't assimilated yet. Tom, that was wonderful. Really glad you were here. I got a call when they first invited me to this convention. They said, we want you to chair the Friday night meeting for when your friend Dick talks, my ex-friend. And I thought, gee, that's just going to be great. I don't have to think about it other than get up and do that. And it wasn't bad. And then a week or so ago, Don calls the house and I'm not there. And Julie, I got a wife named Julie as well. And I want to clear that up real quick. We're not talking about the same Julie. And Julie answered the phone, and I was out of town, and Don says, could we get Gary to talk on Saturday night? And she says, well, I can't answer for him, but I'm sure you can. And he says, well, I didn't think that was a problem. He says, but you got to tell him to trim it to 30 minutes. Now, that was no real big deal. I've been in Denver up until 9 months ago. I lived there for about 9 years, and most of the speaker meetings in Denver will consist of 2 or 3 speakers in an hour's time, and that was common. But in 9 months, I moved to the Midwest 9 months ago, and the common thing there is 1 speaker per hour. I adapted real well. I caught on quick, and so hopefully I can revert back to my old way. You know, when I came into AA myself, the average age must have been around 50, 55, but I was 24. I had spent a life in southeast Wyoming trying to grow up, and I had been around a family, a way of life that was extremely rural. When we say we're out in the sticks in Wyoming, we ain't kidding. Matter of fact, I got a friend that moved out there recently from this part of the country, and he's traveling from Casper to Gillette, wasn't it? And first time through the state and all that, and he stops in Casper to gas up to go to Gillette, and he asks the lady how far it is, and she says, well, it's 113 miles. And being from the Midwest, so there's a lot to see, you know, he says, well, what's between here and there? And she said 113 miles. And so I grew up in a place where I didn't see many different things, and I didn't see many different people. But the ones I did see were kind of what I wanted to be when I grew up. Now, I was raised on an experimental farm just outside of Cheyenne. What we did was we experimented with plants and vegetables to see what would grow at about 7,000 feet in about an 80-day growing season. We did not experiment with people. At least I don't think I was an experiment. I was around cowboys, I was around oil people, I was around ranchers, people who I always seemed to look up to, because these were people, these men were men that could take care of themselves. And I was kind of taught that a real man goes up, he pays his bills, you know, he goes to church, he takes care of his family, or if he wasn't married, he could take care of his women. And if he got in a beef, he could handle himself. And I thought, well, okay, that's what I'm going to be when I grow up. And I had a problem, though. Because when I started growing up, I grew fast, straight up. But I forgot to put any beef on me. And I was extremely skinny. And as a result, I took some horrible beatings because I was really going to try to do what I'd seen those other people do, you know. And right up until the time I hit the nut house to get sober, I had suffered from flunking being a man. I had this horrible thing of knowing what I wanted to be, but everything I tried to do, I didn't do. And Tom's remark, celebrating 4 D's and an F, I really do identify with, because that was a good semester for me in high school. I am not the story of the overachiever as a young man. Or as an older man. I can tell you my first fascination with alcohol, because I was around it a lot. You know, I was always around drinking. My dad was known to take a drink. And all his friends would do that. And the same thing. And so I was always around it, and I was always kind of fascinated with it. And my mother was an Al-Anon back then, and I'll guarantee you they never heard Al-Anon in Wyoming at that time. But she seemed to have a knack to find men that drank. And her whole life was seemed to be kind of the Al-Anon tradition, if you will. They always seem to find one that can drink, or can't drink. And that was her situation. And she had such a hate and a despicable thing to her what alcohol was and drinking was. And so I was in a constant dilemma, because she was saying it was miserable and it was a sin and it was a terrible thing, and my dad just thought it was wonderful, and the people he hung with. And so I was always fascinated about it. And I remember my first drink, and I remember it pretty good, because there were some neighbors up the road that had a pantry off their kitchen, you know, a closet with about 5 shelves in it, and there was probably 6-8 bottles on every shelf, as I remember. As a matter of fact, I used to open that closet door when I had the chance and look at it, and that was my goal. One day I was going to have me a closet just like that one. And you know, I never could get it in quick enough to get that to happen. But my first drink was as a young man, and that fascination, I broke into their house one day when they were gone. And I went straight to that closet, and I took a drink out of each one of those bottles just as quick as I could. You know, I'd pop the top and take a slug and put the top back on and reach for another one. And, you know, nothing happened. I heard a car drive up, so I split, and I don't think they know to this day I was in there drinking their booze. But that was the first drink I took. And I got no idea how old I was. You know, hell, I could have been 10, I could have been 13, I don't know. But the next time I had a drink, I made sure I had enough to drink. And it was at a state basketball tournament in Laramie. And at a state basketball conference. And 3 guys, me and 2 others, went and got us a fifth of 4 roses. And he went and picked up a couple of girls, and we took off for the nice street hill. And the funny part of that is we really didn't know what to do with either one. And we started passing that jug around, you know, and I took a big slug and I passed it on. That was the first time around. And the second time around, I didn't pass it on so quick, because I turned it up and I kept it up as long as they let me, and they finally took it away from me. And I tell you this story simply because you can just about track my whole drinking life based on that story. Because some interesting things happened there. Of course, I got roaring drunk, and I got sick, and I threw up on the girl I was making passes at. And she just beat the hell out of me. And then a little while later, I took a big swing at this cowboy, and he beat the hell out of me. And the next morning, I woke up and I told a whole bunch of lies to justify my behavior from the night before. And that was kind of the track that started the rest of my tracks for a long time. It's interesting because as far back as I can remember, even before that time, I guess I always felt there was something inside of me that made me different from everybody else. And somehow I knew I didn't measure up. And I could sit in a class in school and And I could look around that room, and I knew I wasn't like the rest of these people in there. And, you know, it's kind of like I had a big wart in the end of my nose or something, and I just didn't fit. And I would just never felt like I was a part of in any situation. That was even true at home, particularly if there was a visitor in the house. It was no longer my house. And probably the only time I could remember up until that time where I was a part of was that night was when I was throwing up on them and getting whipped. And that's kind of life I had. And again, I was still extremely skinny. And I could look at myself in the mirror or something like that, and I didn't even like the way I looked. You could put a new suit on me or something. It didn't look right on me because it was on me. It would look good on somebody else, but it didn't look right on me. Very briefly, I managed to get through high school. I was always able to make up those F's somehow. And I got out of high school. And I got through a short term in the Army. My Army career was slightly different from Tom's. The court martials I identify with, but the letters of commendation I damn sure don't. I got out of the Army, and Julie and I got married. I was 19 and she was 18. And it wasn't too much later that we had a 8.5-pound baby girl that was 4 months premature. And I was setting about to make a living and measure up. And the only thing that kept me from really measuring up is I kept on drinking to measure up. And it just wasn't working out for me. But things got worse for me in a multitude of ways. And like Tom, I lost everything there was to lose. And by the time I was 24 years old, a time came in my life where I totally and absolutely despised myself. And I had become everything that I had despised. From my time in sitting in the bars and eyeballing the other drunks and saying, you know, if I ever get as bad as that turkey, I'm going to quit. You know, from that time I got to where I knew I was worse than that guy had ever been. I just flat could not stand anything there was to do with me. And the series of circumstances that I don't think I'll go through right now because I want to talk about recovery. That's selfishly. We used to talk about recovery a lot back home, and when I moved to Indiana, we could go to a 55-minute meeting and hear 52 minutes of drunk and 3 minutes of getting well. And at this point, I have been sober about 4 years longer than I drank. And I see the recovery part of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's what saved my life. And it's still doing it one day at a time. But at any rate, I hit a nut house, the Wyoming State Hospital, at 24 years old, at 6 feet 2 inches tall, and something under 130 pounds. And you know, one fella said we could stick a black suit on me and send me out at 6 o'clock. But I was not well, you understand? And I had all these fantasies of what I really wanted to be. And another fellow one time expelled him out. He has a mind that works a little differently than mine, but he spelled out the same sort of fantasy of what he wanted to be when he grew up. We were both 30 when we were sharing this story, but you know, it was kind of like he wanted to be 6 foot 2 inches tall, be 200 pounds, priest, stud. At any rate, I was 24 years old. I hit that nut house on the 3rd day of December, 1964. And I very often have said that I haven't had a drink since I became an alcoholic. And that's because when I hit that nut house, all I knew was that I was not operating like other people did. And all the people that hollered at me about drinking too much and all of that had really never made any sense to me. And when I hit that place, it was totally because I absolutely despised myself, and I was willing to do anything anybody else said if I thought I could get better. And I went in there willing to live in an 8-foot room for the rest of my life, as that's what it was going to take. And I went in there. I was a little drunk when I showed up at the door, and they asked me if I had come to that hospital to take part in their alcoholic rehabilitation program. And I thought real quick, what would I rather be, a nut or an alcoholic? And I said, you bet. And you know, it wasn't too much later, I found out I was. And it's interesting. I don't want to dwell on that part of the thing, but what happened to me, I was in there for 16 weeks. And the biggest thing that happened to me was they turned me on to AA, which really, frankly, didn't thrill me a whole lot. They went to the AA meetings in the hospital, and generally somebody came up from Salt Lake or from Evanston or someplace to share with us in the meetings. And I'd sit and listen to them, and they would talk about getting up in the morning and saying a prayer. And they'd talk about not having a drink for whatever it was, 6 months or 5 years, or the whole thing. And I knew they were lying to me. Yeah, I just flat knew that it wasn't that way, that nobody was that square. People didn't live like that. And I didn't buy it, but it's interesting. I got dried out long enough in there that one day I heard myself telling somebody, and this is the way it happened because it's a thought I'd never had in my life, but I heard myself telling somebody that I never wanted to drink again. And it was an absolute novel thought to me. I'd never thought of that in my life. And I built some of my old ideas right in there on what it was going to be like living for the rest of my life without a drink. And and I kind of thought, geez, if I was kind of like the rest of these old geezers in this ward, their life's already shot anyway, and going without a drink for the rest of their lives ain't going to be too bad. I got a hell of a lot longer to go, I think. And I made another mistake when I left there, because I was sure that the only secret to the Alcoholics Anonymous program, was don't drink. Now, I'd spent all my life never fitting in and always wandering around terrified and guilty and scared. It's like I always had this hole in my belly with the wind blowing through it. And I got in this nut house and I found out I was an alcoholic, and somehow I found out that I never wanted to drink again. And physically I got up to about 175 pounds and I felt real good, and they sprung me from that place one evening and they put me on a Greyhound bus back home. It was about a 500-mile trip. An interesting thing happened, because I hadn't been out of that nut house for 2 hours on that bus ride. And you know what? I got that hole in my belly with the wind blowing through it back. And it was right there. And from that time, for quite a spell, the only difference between the days after I got out of that nut house and the day I went in was I was sober and I was physically better. But I wasn't doing a thing to change my life. Not a thing. I would go to an AA meeting, and I would stay busy. I worked 2 jobs and went to college, and getting pats in the back for being great, I thought. And I was dying. I never stopped lying. I didn't stop writing bad checks. It wasn't long, and I'd lost most of the weight I'd gained in the nut house. I didn't drink. Yeah, thank God, and it was only because of him. It wasn't because of me, I'll guarantee you. I stayed sober in Laramie for 3.5 years to finish school. And I guess the only way I can describe those 3.5 years, and I hope none of you ever have to go through with it, because I think I'm one case where the statement that my best day drunk was never as good as my worst day sober, I'm not sure I buy that story in my case. Because it was miserable. It was white-knuckle sobriety, if you will, and I mean literally. Because I used to go down where the AA group meets and I'd study. And I would literally hold on to the arm of the chair and say, damn it, I'm not going to take a drink today. God, don't let me take a drink today. And I really wanted to. Because, I just couldn't stand the way things were. Well, we moved to Denver after I finished school. And a series of things happened to me that's the only way it could have happened. It was nothing that I did. I went to a meeting. It was much like the AA meeting in Laramie for a while, where the only part of the big book that I ever heard was the first portion of the 5th chapter. And honest to God, that's all I thought the big book was for, is to get up and read that portion in front of the meeting. And I was dying. And a series of circumstances put me in with the Denver Young People's Group. And I walked in there, and at this time, I'd been dry for 3.5 years, and I figured I had seniority against that bunch of pups. And so I was going to tell them how to stay sober, as if I knew a whole lot about it. And I tried, and I was saying some things like, you can take these steps in any order you please. What the hell, they're up there, just grab one and take it. And it's interesting, and this little bitty guy come up to me one time, and he says, Gary, he says, you can do that if you want to. And he says, and the worst thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to find out it don't work. And that's kind of how it happened, is I monkeyed around with it long enough that that's exactly what I found out. But fortunately, some things happened, and I'll share those with you. And it wasn't necessarily the Young People's Group. But a few of us got together with the big book, and we started meeting in homes. And we started reading out of the book and talking as we went. And what we did is they took me through the big book that time for the first time from front to back. And as we were getting along and getting into the steps, they keep telling me that they took the steps in order. Now this is interesting, because I'm talking to guys who obviously had something that I didn't have. And the most obvious thing I can think of they had was they could look me in the eye. But I couldn't look them in the eye. If you looked me in the eye, I knew you could see right down here and see that hole in my belly and see how terrified I really was. At any rate, I don't really know what else happened other than I was put around people that had something. And they had a lot. Well, this trip through the book, I all of a sudden truly got in touch with the first step. Certainly I'd been powerless over alcohol. And I knew that, or I probably would never have been able to white-knuckle it through those days in Laramie. But what else happened there is interesting, because we got into the big book and we got into the first page of the 3rd chapter. And there's that line in there that says we must fully concede to our innermost selves that we are alcoholic. This is the first step to recovery. And the delusion that we're anything like other people or presently may be has to be smashed. And you know what? That set me free, man, because I had known all my life I wouldn't like other people. And I had a sneaking hunch I didn't ever want to be like other people. But honest to God, that's what happened. I'm an alcoholic. I'm not like other people. And this craziness that I've been going through for 27, 28 years at that time seemed to fit into that. And that was it. And so we went on through the book. And the second step happened to me. I certainly never took it. I don't know how I could take the second step. But I came to believe, because I had been around AA for, by that time, a long time. So, in my eyes, a long time. And I saw God getting other people well. And I mean, there were some sick puppies coming in, and they were getting well, and they were going right by me. And it was very obvious to me that no human power was doing that. And that's how it happened to me. Is God got you all sober, and I watched Him do it. We got into the 3rd step, and we started talking about the decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood it. And by this time, I'm starting to feel a little bit better. And I start to think that maybe what this I've been listening to for all this time is really real, and it may really work. And so one night I opened the big book to the 3rd step prayer. And I read the prayer, praying the prayer. And then I got to thinking about what I was doing. And I got to thinking about every other decision I had ever made in my life and what they had turned into. And I said, God, please make that first prayer real. And damn it, I really mean it. And it was interesting. And I had another circumstance that parallels with Tom's. There was a couple of guys in the Denver Young People's Group at that time who I was saving. They were calling me about every night saying, "Gary, I need a meeting. Can you come get me?" And we always managed to pick meetings where the discussion for the night was the fourth step. And they always managed to explain to me if I hadn't taken the fourth step, I didn't have a thing to say. And I guess maybe I'm still a little dogmatic about what they did to me, and I just thank God for them. Because that attitude was just what I needed to have. Nobody said to me, "You can take that step when you're ready." They said, "You better get at it." And I said, "Well, I've taken inventory in my head for years." Now, I won't use the word they used when I said that. But it was unmistakably clear that they didn't believe I had ever taken an inventory. And that's the kind of attitude I think now about anybody else. If you haven't taken a written inventory, you haven't taken one. And I'm sorry, if you don't agree. I ain't going to hit you if you don't agree, but I just don't believe it. And so I sat down one night and I wrote all night at my first attempt at inventory. And it was probably the longest night of my life. And I went to bed as the sun was coming up in the morning. And the only reason I went to bed is it seemed like I was done writing. I couldn't think of another thing to put down. Not a thing. And during this time, I'm going to these meetings, I had run into another fella in Denver, big, good-looking Chicano guy. And he and I didn't like each other much. And which isn't unusual in Laramie, Wyoming, for a guy like me and a guy like him not to like each other. But I know why I didn't like him. And it was interesting. We used to go to the young people's meeting, and to be polite and put on the show that we were all loving one another, we would give each other the peace sign. And that seemed to keep everybody cool and all that. The only thing was, is Ernie's missing this finger. And he'd get to me every time. Along about the same time, Ernie disappears for a while. Nobody knows what happened to him, and I didn't particularly care. But after about 3 weeks, he showed back up at the meeting. And it's like he was a whole different guy. I mean, he could look me in the eye, and there was something going on in there. Somebody was home. And, I can't say it was just a whole different guy. He was all of a sudden, he was happy, and he seemed to shine, and he had this thing kind of going from him. And it was interesting. And he shared that he had gone to Texas and written a fourth and a fifth, and taken a fifth step with some people down there at Whitney. And it was interesting because I finished my inventory. By this time, somebody had told me that I might try going to a convention somewhere. And so 4 of us are showing up actually a day late for a convention. We couldn't all get out in time to get there, so we're showing up on Saturday morning. And it's a little corner, Colorado. It's a town called Lamar. And it's real easy to get to from Denver. There's only one turn. You can't get lost. Well, we showed up late because we got lost. And, there were only 2 rooms left at the motel. And I'll guarantee you the selection of motels in Lamar is really thin. And so that meant we had to share rooms. And you know who I got. And he knew I had that inventory. And he started leaning to me all weekend to take a fifth step. And he says, "Gary, I don't care who you take it with, but this little town is full of people who work steps and have got some solid sobriety and would love to see you grow up." He said, "You get it done." And I took my fifth step with Ernie. I took my fifth step with a guy I didn't like. And needless to say that Ernie and I, probably from that time on, have become the dearest of friends. And we've shared a lot every time we see each other. And I won't see him for maybe a year at a time. And we'll meet somewhere for lunch, and it's like I just left him last night. The relationship is that close, and the love that's built up in this fellowship, it's just crazy. It's just out of sight. I was asked to speak the Sunday morning of that convention and give a little talk. And so I got up and I shared my story up until this point, up through the fifth step. And I walked out of there, and there was a lady came up to me afterwards, and she says, Gary, she says, I really got the feeling that this time you told the truth. And she was right. I went home that Sunday night, and I took steps 6 and 7, using the big book as my guide. And I said the 7-step prayer, and I got started looking at amends. But what I want to tell you is that weekend, something happened to me, and my life has not been the same since. That hole in my belly, with the wind blowing through it, seemed to slam shut. And as I stand here tonight, I guarantee you I have never had that feeling of terror and fear and guilt and unworthiness that I had up until then. It has never been back. I'm not saying I haven't done some damn fool things and haven't been scared now and then. No, I think God is protecting us when He makes me be sure I'm afraid of big trucks and bad women and or whatever, But I'm not going to touch it. And I guess if there's anything I can really share, I'd love to go on to the steps. My program has been from that time on one where I believe I should continually work steps. And the groups I have been in primarily from that time on are groups where we very often as a group take the steps together in order. And we go through them and we start over. And we go through them and we start over. And so each time I go through the steps, I see something from a little different angle and a whole new perspective. And very often I see things that are glaring that I've never seen before. I was a pretty sick pup and I could conceal things pretty well. The move to Indianapolis was probably the biggest adjustment that Julie and I have had to make in our lives. Because we were in such a beautiful cocoon in Denver with our group. And Dick was a member of that group. And it was a thing that we were so close and we were literally protected. Like you said, the coffee in the cup. And that whole thing, and all of a sudden I'm running down the side of the cup over here in some damn place in Indiana. And I got to grow up again. And so I got to use the people that I've met in places like this because I'm not acquainted in Indiana and I got a traveling job. And so I took a 5th step with Paul in Chicago. And I found another friend in Columbus, Ohio, and another one in Cincinnati. And that seemed to hold me together. And all of a sudden I got me a friend in Indianapolis who works steps and believes we ought to work steps together. And we got a whole new meeting going on Friday nights in the southeast corner of Indianapolis where we work steps together. And it's just like being back in Denver. And my God has taken care of me like I can't tell you. It's just been wonderful. My life has gone from a life where God was not talked about at all to the point where He's absolutely a part of my life in a way that I used to resent. I never understood why some people talked about God made me mad. I resented Him. And I never understood that. And now I are one. I am extremely grateful to be here. And I really think if there's two things that I can share with you, they are this. And very simply put is for those of you who maybe don't really identify with everything I've talked about, I can promise you that you don't ever have to hurt like that again. Because this thing really works. It really does. Thank you very much.
Speak, and I'm going to let Tom Seeley from Montgomery, Alabama, hold for it.
I'm Tom Clonch, and I'm an alcoholic. Hey, y'all. Now, I think it's great to be here. This is about too much for a country boy from Hayneville, Alabama, but I guarantee you I love it. And I was thinking when he talked about having fun a minute ago that there were lots of times in my life when I went to AA meetings and I saw some guy stand up with a suit on behind a rostrum And he'd say, I'm glad I'm an alcoholic. And I was sitting out there thinking I'd rather be a one-legged Russian midwife than an alcoholic. But I guarantee you tonight I think that there's some people in this room that may feel that way, but I know there's an awful lot of us that are glad that we're alcoholics, because that's what got us here where we are now, and that's what gives us the hope of a future one day at a time that we all share together. And that's what's so beautiful about this program. I want to thank the committee for inviting me and for letting my wife and I share this opportunity with you. As I read the big book, and as my sponsors in Alabama taught me, there's a format for giving one of these talks. You tell how it was and what happened and how it is now. And in fact, in the big book, in about the 3rd chapter, no, maybe it's even before that, there's one place in there that says our stories disclose how we had an experience and found God. And that's an important part of my story. But I want to start at the beginning, because what you're looking at up here, and the only real message I can bring, is a real live modern day 20th century miracle. That's what I am. And when I tell how it was and what happened and how it is now, I hope that's the message that I bring across. And maybe that somebody sitting in this room will feel the way I did a couple times when y'all latched onto me. And I'd be sitting back there and I'd be saying, if that guy can stay sober, darn if I can't stay sober. That's the message that I can share with you. Because I used to worry and try to intellectualize and worry about an awful lot of things. But that's what I share. And when I first read the big book and I looked at the stories in the back, the first place I turned was back there in the back, you know. And I saw all those juicy soap operas. They were better than As the World Turns. But I didn't get any message out of it. But somewhere along the line, when y'all and some sponsors got enough AA into me, I realized that that's what they were back there for, to show me a miracle, what can happen and how a life can change and how we can indeed live again by a program and the grace of God as I understand Him operating through people just like y'all in the 12 steps. So that's what I'll share with you. I might mention that there were a lot of times in my early AA career and before AA when I was reading books and things about alcoholism, and I used to worry about what kind of alcoholic I was. You know, you got spree alcoholics and you got daily alcoholics and you got periodic alcoholics. Now, I know what kind of alcoholic I am. Y'all taught me. I'm a period alcoholic. I can't drink, period. And y'all taught me this. Y'all taught me this, and I need to remember it one day at a time. I want to share a little story with you that I like very much because it tells me something. It's about a preacher. And since I are a Southern Baptist, we'll make him a Baptist preacher. But anyway, this particular preacher had really done the job. He'd been a great shepherd of his flock. And after serving in his church for years, the congregation got together and gave him, he and his wife, a long extended vacation. And gave him some money, and they went off to Hawaii. And they stayed in Hawaii a long time and just had a wonderful, wonderful vacation. They came back home. And the preacher and his wife got in the car to drive to church that Sunday morning to preach his first sermon coming back. And the wife looked over like wives do, and she said, what are you going to preach about this morning? And he said, I think I'll preach about surfing. And she says, you can't preach about surfing. What in the world has surfing got to do with a sermon? He said, there's some philosophical and spiritual points about surfing that I believe I can bring out a corollary. And she says, you can't preach about surfing. You don't know anything about it. And they got in a big argument, like sometimes happens. And when they got to the church, the wife said, if you're going to preach about surfing, I'm not going to be embarrassed. I'm not even going in there. I'm going to stay in the car. And the preacher got out and went on in the church and went back in his little office to do whatever preachers do in their little office, you know. And he got to thinking about it, and he said, maybe that gal's right. And I better preach on something else. And he looked in his file drawer, and he pulled out this old dog-eared sermon on sex. And all Baptist preachers got a good one. And he went out that morning, and he preached a sermon about sex you wouldn't believe. It was the greatest sermon. The little old ladies in the back were cheering, and it was fantastic. In fact, his sermon on sex was so good that when the service was over and all the people burst out of the front door, 2 or 3 sweet little Baptist ladies saw the preacher's wife. And they ran over there to the car, and they said, it was wonderful, it was amazing, we're sorry you missed this beautiful sermon that he preached. And she said, well, I can't understand that. It's a subject he doesn't know anything about. She said he only did it 2 times, once before we were married and once after we were married. And he fell off both times. Well, what we have there is a total breakdown in communication, you see. And as Father Martin sometimes says, I'm going to be hearing what I say with my ears, and you're going to be hearing what I say with your ears. And I hope that we can communicate the little message that I can share. I know there will be those here who won't be able to communicate with us, but I think you will if you'll try to work our program. And I'll say some things, I hope I don't, but I may say some things that you won't agree with, and that's okay. But part of my message is that there's a book. It's sitting right here, and it's the big book. It's all right if you disagree with Tom Clunch, but you're in a world of trouble when you start disagreeing with what's written in this book, because this is the way our program works, and it's the guideline, it's the rules to our game. And when David was talking this morning and gave that beautiful history about AA, it just was reinforced in my mind the fact that I believe that this book right here, and you think about what David said, or you go read the AA Comes of Age and study up on what happened in that period of time, and you'll believe just as much as I do that this book is definitely divinely inspired. It has too much in it, and the way it came about was too unique, and too many people have benefited from it, and me, for it to have been just the works of the mind of man. And then you start thinking about those early ones, and I'm not demeaning at all the background of Bill or Bob or anybody, but they were just drunks off the street, playing it by ear and relying on a higher power. And Bill sat down on the side of his bed, and he wrote those 12 steps in less than a half an hour. And they did have a big argument about it, like David said, but they only changed about 4 or 5 words, and that's the way it was. So my sponsors in Alabama grabbed me, and when they caught me right, they taught me to work my program that way. And that's what I try to do, one day at a time, in my own way. And, you know, I was thinking as we were sharing a little while ago, our speaker last night was introduced as the young speaker, and I'm 2 years younger than he is. But, you know, his story was similar to mine in that I think I was one of these ones that's an alcoholic from the very first, and there are some. But there's another type of young member in AA right now. They're not the ones that started out full-blown alcoholics and became chronic alcoholics in the mid-20s, but they're a new type of young person who aren't low-bottom alcoholics like I am. They stopped in time. They were brought in and given our program and quit while they're still young, and that's a different type of young alcoholic altogether, and it's so tremendously wonderful to see them. Because you see, and the reason that's so important to me is because when I share with you what it was like, some of you may not identify, and I am so glad because you don't have to go as far down, and you don't have to do the things that I did to later on find sobriety in this program. And there's a lot of people in this room that can testify to that. I graduated from a little bitty high school in Hayneville, Alabama, right in the heart of Baptist country and good old country folks, and my graduating class at Hayneville High School had 19 students in it. Give you an idea how big it was. And there was none of this business about peer group pressure for me to drink at that age, you know. And, well, I tell you what we did. At Hayneville High School, the boys played football, basketball, and baseball and chased the girls. And the girls let us catch them. That's all that went on at Hayneville High School. And anyway, I don't remember maybe experimenting with alcohol a couple times, but then I got grown at 17 and a half, and I went off to Auburn to be my own man. And there, I started out in what the big book later on told me was that insane compulsion that we have to learn to drink like a normal person, or to learn to drink like a Southern gentleman, if you were my type of drinker. But that was the illusion that almost killed me, and yet it was sitting right there in about the 2nd chapter in the big book. But when I got off to Auburn, I was filled with dreams, and I recommend these dreams, and I'm teaching it to my children. My dreams and my whole pattern of life had been psyched into me that I was supposed to graduate from an accredited college. I was supposed to get a job with a large corporate structure and rise unerringly to the top. I was supposed to marry a beautiful blonde girl, preferably from a rich family. I was supposed to have a couple kids, have a 3-bedroom brick with 2 cars to go in the garage, and be a deacon in the Baptist church. That's what I was supposed to do. And I don't see anything wrong with that at all, except that I'm an alcoholic, and that means that I don't get along with ethyl alcohol. I don't get along with ethyl alcohol in any form. Wild Turkey or Jack Daniels or Squeeze or Aqua Velva. I just don't get along with ethyl alcohol. And so that after 1 quarter at Auburn, I was celebrating my grades. I'd made 4 D's and an F, and I was partying. And to make a long story short, I wrecked my roommate's car. It just kind of turned over by itself. And when I woke up in jail, I found out that my pattern was a little bit off this track I was telling you about. So then the Dean of Men. The Dean of Men asked me not to come back to Auburn, and I went down to New Orleans where my dad was stationed then and worked a while. And then I matriculated into the University of Alabama because I was still chasing that dream. And I found out that the only difference in the university and in Auburn was that at Alabama they drank with ties on, And I started out doing something which was a pattern in my life. My life went from crisis to crisis, but there was another pattern. I started doing very, very good things at Alabama, and this is to share the difference because you hear so many times, mostly in older alcoholics, he's such a good husband when he's not drinking. Or he's the best mechanic I got when he's not drinking. Or he's an employee that can do 5 times as much as anybody else when he's not drinking. Well, I set out to compensate for my behavior by making real good grades. And for about 4 semesters in a row, I made almost all A's, a B every now and then. And I'm still learning how to drink like a gentleman and having these little crises. And after about 4 semesters at Alabama, and I got to share this with you because it's part of my makeup, A lot of people stand up at the rostrum, and you'll hear them, and our stories are a little different, but a lot of people stand up and they say, when I took that first drink and I felt that warm glow going down, it made me feel bigger than life, and I could drive a car better, and I could talk to the girls better, and I could dance better than anybody else. It didn't affect me that way, because I already knew I could do all those things better than anybody else anyhow, see? In fact, I suffered from a very acute type of inferiority complex. I thought everybody else was inferior. And, but at Alabama, I was out drinking with the boys one night, some of them friends, on a Saturday night. And Tuscaloosa was a small town in those days. And in the middle of the night, about 12 o'clock, a craving was flung on me for some fried catfish. Now, I guarantee you, if a craving's flung, I still get cravings flung on me. But I got up a month or 2 ago and about 12:30 and went out hunting for orange sherbet and had to go to 4 7-Elevens before I found some orange sherbet, but I got it. But if a craving was flung on me when I was drinking, it didn't make a difference whether it belonged to you or the law or anybody else. I was going to get it, and I wanted some fried catfish, and all the restaurants were closed. And this guy I was with, he said, my uncle is a catfish fisherman down on the Warrior River, and he always has a lot of catfish. Let's go over to his house and get some. I said, fine, let's go. When we got to the uncle's house, it was all dark, and obviously nobody was home. So in order to utilize that intellectual behavior and all of that resources that I learned in college, I kicked the door down, you see. And went in and helped ourselves to the catfish, and on the way out, he kind of whispered in my ear, he said, this is my mean uncle. And so I had to do some more intellectual, rational thinking. I got my gun out. I always liked guns. Liked it before I drank, while I drank, and I still like guns. And if there's any psychologists and you want to start talking about guns being an extension of your male virility and all that business, I like the way they sound, And anyhow, I got out my .38 and reasoning, I assassinated the television set. I shot out the picture window. I blew the lock off the door because I was figuring, when the CIA and the FBI and the Alabama State Patrol and the Canadian Northwest Mounties, and when everybody came to investigate this, they'd know it wasn't some fine straight-A student at the university that did it. They'd think it was some interstate desperado. Well, when I woke up in jail, let me tell you what happened there. The dean of men asked me not to come back to the University of Alabama. And the judge asked me not to come back to Tuscaloosa. And I didn't. I didn't go back to Tuscaloosa for 12 more years. And when I did, I went back to Tuscaloosa to do what I'm doing right now, to speak at the Tuscaloosa AA meeting. And I went in after dark and I left before daylight. I don't know what the statute of limitation on grand theft catfish is, you know. Anyhow, I was kicked out of 2 schools. I was a little bit off my track, and, well, I joined the Army. My dad had been in the Army, I'd been in the Guard, and I thought, well, maybe this will help me grow up. I knew there was something wrong with me. I didn't know what it was. I couldn't, you know, even the little old ladies at the Hayneville Baptist Church that loved me so dearly, they were beginning to kind of frown a little bit at my behavior, you know. It's accepted in Hayneville, Alabama, like when I would ride around the square and shoot out the street lights, everybody said that's okay because he's from a fine family, he's just sowing his wild oats, and we do that down there. We go out all week and sow our wild oats and then go to church on Sunday and pray for a crop failure, you know. Anyhow, I joined the Army, and the only difference in the Army in my drinking was that something new, a new element came in. Again, I did that compensating behavior. I did very, very, very good things, and I could. And on the other hand, I knew I was going to do some bad things. And I felt all that period of my life, until AA found me, I felt like the scales of justice that stands out in front of those courthouses, you know, I would do the good things and I would do the bad things and kind of let them balance it out, and I'd feel average. For example, in the Army, I got 2 letters of commendation by general officers. This was before Vietnam, and it was hard to get commendation letters in a peacetime Army. And I got 2 court-martials, you see, and it just balanced out. But finally, I managed honorable discharge, and I got out, and my family had moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I went to the University of Tulsa, and I had a beautiful period of my life. I went a whole year without going to jail but once. And I had I finally graduated. Well, actually, before I graduated, I got married. And I found me a beautiful blonde. She wasn't from a very rich family, but she made up for it in other attributes. And anyway, I married the pretty blonde. I got the job with the large corporate structure, Sears and Roebuck by name. I started rising unerringly to the top. I got 2 beautiful children. I had a pocket full of credit cards. We had a 3-bedroom brick. We were renting it, but we had it. We had a car. We had a bank account. Had friends. I think any earth person that had gone by, including my own parents, people that had awareness and that had concern, and educated people, they would look at me and they would say, there's a young man who has everything. And indeed I did. And I also had alcoholism. Cunning, baffling, powerful, progressive, and terminal. And so it did what alcoholism does. It progressed. And I would go to work, and I remember this just as clear right now. Some days I'd get off at 6, and some nights I'd get off at 9. It didn't make any difference. But about a half hour before I'd get off, I'd start getting these strange little butterflies in my stomach, like I used to have before a big football game. And my palm of my hands would get a little bit moist, and I'd start feeling a little bit fidgety. And, you know, I'd punch the clock, and I'd drive down the street, and I'd pull up on Admiral Boulevard to my whiskey store, where I had established a rapport. The man called me by name when I went in, because every evening I bought a pint of whiskey. And I would walk in there, and I'd put my hand on that pint bottle, and the butterflies would go away. And my hands would dry off. And I'd feel taller, and I'd feel light, and I'd feel good before I even opened it. And then I'd go home, and I'd change into my Bermuda shorts, and I'd have me a straight shot while I was mixing my mixed drink, and life would start to be enjoyable. I would sit down in my big chair in my living room, and I'd turn on my TV set, and I'd flop my feet up on my footstool and drink my bourbon and order my woman around. And I did that. It's what I did every single day. And lots of nights, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, and there would be the TV set all gray and squirrely going, shh, you know, looking at me. And I'd say, Self, you've fallen asleep. You poor overworked young executive. You didn't even eat your supper or go to bed with your pretty wife or anything. You just fell asleep in your big chair. And in the mornings, it's funny about this alcoholism. You taught me that it's a disease that affects you physically, and affects you mentally, and affects you spiritually. And as it began affecting me, it affected me in the exact opposite order from that. The first thing that went in me was my spiritual life. And it's a pretty simple situation. I was brought up and reared in the church and leaned on that activity to a degree. But when your hangovers get bad enough on Sunday morning, you've got to make the decision, I did, of whether to quit drinking heavy on Saturday night or to quit going to Sunday school on Sunday morning. And the only logical decision is to quit going to Sunday school on Sunday morning. And that's what I did. And after that, Sunday mornings became my very worst times because my family would go on to church and I would wake up and tremble and try to drink a little beer or something and maybe even turn the TV on and hear the music. And I would feel so guilty and so remorseful and so empty. The next thing that went in me was my mental capacities. The one thing that always got me good grades and whatnot was that some reason that one of the gifts that I had was a good mind. I can remember things that I would read and I could just answer test questions good. And Sears was hiring me basically for one thing, and that was to make decisions. You know, decisions about buying merchandise, about advertising, about payroll, about the whole thing. And it got where when I'd wake up in the morning, I couldn't decide which pair of shoes to put on. I couldn't decide which suit to wear. I couldn't decide anything. I'd just sit there on the side of the bed, and all through the morning, I practiced, when I got to work, I'd practice what you call on-the-job absenteeism, you know. I'd get me a clipboard or something, and I'd walk all over that big store. I'd go up to advertising down the display and all. Everybody'd say, "Ooh, look at Tom working. Boy, is he going." And all I was doing was walking. Then after lunch, I could settle down and do my work. And I suffered under the belief at that time that Tom Claunch at 80% was better than anybody else at 100% anyway. And I tried to compensate by doing good things. And I believed that my job wasn't suffering. But it was. It's going down a little bit. Somewhere in here is where Julie hooked up with some kind of weird organization called Al-Anon. Now, I love Al-Anons. There is one of the finest Al-Anons from Texas in the world sitting right back there laughing at me. And I love Al-Anons, and my wife, it's great the way we can share our program together. But there's a time in my life where if I was asked to describe Al-Anon, I would have said a bunch of nosy nagging bitches. That's what I'd have said. But anyhow, and this was at the time I'm talking about. They taught her some things. They taught her detach with love. You know, now I like that part because we was already detached and we wasn't getting any love, you know, so I was all for that kind of business. And they taught her another thing called acceptance. And I liked acceptance because then I could sit in my chair and order her around and she'd, you know, pretty well accept that I was going to do it. That's the way I read it. But they taught her something else that was the cruelest thing ever thought up by the mind of woman. They taught her something called, don't take up for your drunk. Don't make excuses for your drunk. Don't cover up for him and pick up his checks and bail him out and everything. Let his problem arise and surface. One morning, the store, I was running a little late, and the store manager called up and says, "Where's Tom? Is he sick?" And Julie said, "No, sir, he's drunk." My problem arose in service. And there's another thing about that period. It was in there somewhere because right after that's when I interviewed the psychologist for a period of time. I even interviewed him in his own office. Talked to the man a lot. But the only thing I knew about AA initially, I had studied a little about AA when I was taking all those psychology courses I took to figure out what was wrong with me. And if anybody's interested, you find AA in an abnormal psychology book. That ought to tell us something. But the only thing I knew for sure about AA was here was some kind of weird organization that had an absolutely unlimited printing budget. Because my house, I had a Mogan David wine bottle full of ice water in my refrigerator because I drank a lot of ice water in the morning in those days. And I went in there one morning, opened my refrigerator and reached for my wine bottle, and right on the side of it was the 12 steps to recovery stuck on my eyeball. I went in to shave, and I was having those acute toothpaste allergy attacks because in the morning, about the time I went to brush my teeth, my eyes would hurt, and my head would hurt, and everything in me would hurt, and I knew it was the toothpaste that was doing it to me, and I changed around. But I opened the mirror to shave, and 44 questions had flooded down into the water. And one morning, I'll promise you, a way of life popped out of the toaster. But anyhow, true. Well, I had my chance because one night, as I got a little sick while taking my straight shot while mixing my mixed drink, one night I condescended to go to a meeting in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In fact, I went for some time. I stood back and I looked at y'all and I marveled. I considered it a great laboratory situation of which I would examine. And I marveled at this beautiful, non-directed, informal group therapy in action that I had the privilege to witness, and wasn't it good for y'all? And I memorized your Serenity Prayer, and I read your juicy soap operas, and I took great pride in the fact that the meetings were over at 9, but the whiskey store didn't close till 10, and I never drank before the meetings. I always drank after the meetings. It was a point of pride in me. And obviously, no help for me. Now, I had a chance to be one of those high-bottom young drunks I was talking about. But Pete, you told me, the psychologist told me, some friends told me, some Al-Anons told me, everybody told me that it was going to get worse because alcoholism is progressive, and I didn't believe it. But on the other hand, I will say that I was, quote, not ready. Now, that is not a license for us, to say, well, he's not ready, let him go. Because some people are ready, and we don't know the difference. And to the same degree, I'm not knocking AA old-timers or even AA new-timers or whatever we are. But all I'm saying is that we can sometimes smugly sit back and we can criticize a doctor or somebody for not helping somebody. And at the same time, if we had the same guy, which was me, we'd have just said, well, he ain't ready yet, So I wasn't ready. And let me tell you what happened to me quickly in the next 2 years. Because from having everything, within 2 years, battling alcohol head and head, I lost. And I lost absolutely everything that a human being can lose except my life itself. And on numerous occasions, I was hoping for that. First thing that happened was in Tulsa. One day, and I'll make this sort of short because it was a 3-day holiday and we had guests coming over for dinner that night about 7. And I started drinking pretty heavy about 6 that morning. And, somewhere in the evening, one of my things was I never was a wife hitter. I didn't believe that was in the role of being a Southern gentleman, even a drunk Southern gentleman. But what I was a psychological warfare expert. I was bigger than Julie. And I learned how to threaten her. And I learned innuendos. And I learned methods where I could drive her absolutely up the wall by just the mouth. And that's what I put on her. And this particular night, I don't remember it exactly, but I believe I said something to the effect that I would take our little 3-month-old boy and grab him by the feet and beat him against the wall until his brains ran down the wallpaper. And to demonstrate graphically that point, I took a bottle of Heinz 57 sauce and threw it in the middle of the floor and busted it and then ordered her to clean it up. Well, a few more minutes. Don't ever go to Oklahoma, friends, if you want to do like I did, because they got some weird laws out there. I had been arrested on several occasions for what they call public drunk. I had been arrested for what they call common drunk. But they got a dude out there they call private drunk. That's where your wife calls the police and they arrest you in your own living room. And that's what was going to happen to me. And the policeman came in and I said, wait a minute, friends. I know you don't want to go to court in Bermuda shorts and shower shoes. And I said, let me change my clothes. And they said, okay. And I went back in my bedroom. And as I was taking a nip out of my reserve pint in my sock drawer, I spied my shotgun. And I said, Self, why don't we have a little bit of fun with the Tulsa Police Department? So I got my shotgun down and I stuck it around the corner and I said, fellas, I got a loaded shotgun back here. And they said, Anyway, about a half hour later when I tired of that game and decided to escape out the bedroom window, it was some dude with a helmet on behind one of my trees with his riot gun. And what they had done, they had called out SWAT. And fact of the matter is, they had the mobile TV cameras there. And a lot of people think I got fired from Sears, but I didn't. I called up in the Tulsa County Jail and resigned. But, I ended up with the choice of going to jail for a long, long time or going to the insane asylum. I elected the insane asylum, court committed. And a case in point, and I got to share this with you because I was there to be committed for 6 weeks, and after 5 weeks there of not drinking, of AA-oriented open ward in a pretty darn good mental institution, You know, you would think, and medically I was sober. But mentally and spiritually, I was still so drunk you wouldn't believe it, because I was going to get out in 3 or 4 more days, and the craving was flung on me to escape. And so, when the craving flung on me to do it, I do it. And if you ever want to do it, I dressed up in our Sunday visiting clothes, and I got me a clipboard, because I've observed if you get a clipboard and dress up, you can walk fast and go anywhere. And I went over to the administration building, and I was going to go in, and this was way out in the woods in Benita, Oklahoma, and it had the gates and everything, the bars. But a man was coming down, and I said, "Mister," I said, "it's raining out here, and here I am, a fine young graduate student at the University of Tulsa, out here trying to get a job to help these poor sick folks. And I said, would you give me a ride into town?" And he said, "Sure, son, hop right in." And as we were driving through the big gates, I looked over his sun visor, and that dude was a deputy sheriff. He brought some poor soul in there, but he took me out. Well, I fled. I sort of halfway kidnapped my little 3-month-old boy and fled to Alabama on an airplane. And later on, I had to go back and surrender and be properly discharged. And I got a job teaching school to help the youth of America, and drank and drank. And I reached that point in my drinking that I think an awful lot of alcoholics, at least I did, have to reach. I've heard it said this way: the chains of alcoholism are invisible until they're too strong to break. The chains of alcoholism are invisible until they're too strong to break. You know, I can quit any time I want to, but I don't want to. Well, somewhere along after we got the family back to Alabama and it really got bad, I wanted to. And let me tell you, I got the 2 prettiest children in the world. And if any man could quit for his children, or quit for his wife, or quit for his Baptist church, or his mom and dad, or anybody, I could have done it. I had that sort of motivation still around me. But I couldn't. And I reached that point where I went to hospitals, and I'd go in on Monday, and I'd get detoxed by Thursday, and I'd feel good on Friday, and I'd get drunk on Saturday. And I did that time and time again. And I went through periods of not drinking and periods of drinking. And I reached that evil, evil place where I was 100% absolutely, completely, totally unhappy when I was not drinking. I was 100% absolutely, completely unhappy and guilty when I was drinking. And that left me one place to go, and that was pass out. And I'd do that. I'd get a half-a-gallon jug of I.W. Harper, retreat to my bedroom, and I'd pass out as long as I could. But somebody that loved me would scoop me up, literally, and haul me off to a hospital. Well, I went in this one hospital, in and out, time and time again, and finally they took me to another one, some Al-Anon ladies. Julie was going to Al-Anon again. See, I owe most of my sobriety to them, and I'll tell anybody without a minute's notice that I believe the disease of alcoholism, that family disease of alcoholism, is indeed much harder on the spouse than it is on the alcoholic. You see, when things got bad and the cars were being repossessed and the bills weren't paid and everything was bad, I could pass out. But Julie had to stay awake and face it. And when the time came, Al-Anon propped Julie up enough, and they took me off to an AA doctor. And this sadistical dude didn't believe in all these thorazines and shots and let you sleep and let you go. He thought you ought to sweat and shake. And I sweated and shaked in and out of that hospital about 3 times, and then finally, let me tell you what happened. Tuskegee, Alabama is not that big, but let me tell you what happened. On the 3rd day of the 3rd hospitalization, a little over 7 years ago, my daddy came to visit me, and that was highly irregular. He's a particularly unique man and kind of a stereotype Army colonel, but a beautiful person. And he'd endorsed a phrase at that time that made me sick, but I love it now. He would look me dead now and he would say, "I love you, son, because you're my son, but I don't like you." And he came to see me, and he said, "Son, I've got some bad news for you." And I thought the man was kidding. The 3rd day of the 3rd hospitalization, no job, no family. I'd been fired from 3 or 4 jobs, had no hope to get one. And he said, "Julie has taken the children and gone home to Oklahoma and probably won't be back. And she called the finance company and they, said she couldn't pay for it. And they've come and got that new mobile home y'all were buying. And so I've got your things in my garage, son. I love you because you're my son, but I don't like you. And I don't know how to help you." You see, when I lost my home, I completely lost it. When I got home, it was just some concrete blocks there. But in my own mind, I knew at that point that I could not go on. I knew at that point that
I knew at that point that I had to end my life. Now, I've thought about suicide many times before. 3 different houses or 2 different houses, depending on who's remembering it. I sat on the side of the bed and was going to shoot myself with my shotgun, and Julie would have the audacity to go to sleep and not watch me kill myself, so I'd shoot a hole in the ceiling to wake her up, you know. But I was the type of suicide up to this point that you hear about who cast themselves in front of a parked car, you know, or one of them dudes that flings himself out of the basement window. That was my type of suicide. But at this point, at this one instant in my life, when I was forced to kind of get a little bit honest, I realized that I would take my life from an altruistic motive. I would kill myself not to get poor little old me out of the poor little old problems I was in. I'd kill myself to get the millstone that I was out from around the neck of the 5 people that still loved me. My daughter and my mother and my sister and one little old lady at the Baptist church and maybe Julie a little bit. And so there was a big lake in front of this place, and I was ambulatory, you know how I are. I was just going to run down there and I was going to drown. I was going to holler and let them watch me, but the book tells us that when, let's do it this way. A lot of people have taught me all my life, and here's where you can disagree with me. But a lot of people have taught me all my life that God helps those who help themselves. I'm going to stand here and tell you that that is not true. It's not the way I read the big book, and it's not the way I read the Scripture. God helps those who admit they are helpless. That's the way I believe it. And I stood at that door and cried out in that voice of utter desperation. And a little something kind of told me, Tom, you better touch base with the Baptist preacher before you do this thing. And then crazy as I was, and you'd have to understand Tuskegee, Alabama, but I looked in the phone book and there was 2 Baptist churches, and I knew one of them was the black Baptist preacher and one of them was the white Baptist preacher. And darned if I was going to let the black Baptist preacher save my soul before I committed suicide, you know. And I was too proud to go ask the black attendants in there which was which. That's how crazy I was before you found me. And I stood back and opened the door for a man to walk down the hall and gone. And a little old black lady right behind me, hadn't said a word in an hour. She looked right at me and she said, "Isn't that Reverend Butler, the Baptist minister?" And I said, "I don't know, lady, but I'm going to find out." And I followed him down the hall, and he would tell you later on that he didn't particularly know why he was there that day. I know, and later on he knew. But he was a Baptist preacher, and we prayed a little bit together, and something went away. I think I surrendered a little bit, or I gave up, or I turned it over, or whosever terminology you want. And as soon as he left, that AA doctor came in, and he didn't visit that time of day. And we talked a little bit. And as soon as he left, George and Clara from the Tuskegee AA group came in and visited with me. And before they left, the phone rang, and Buddy said he was coming to check me out and take me to Opelika to a meeting. And when I got back from the meeting, the only nurse on 3 shifts that was a member of Al-Anon sat up all night long with me, and we talked. And I never went back in that deep, deep depression, and something went away. The doctor told me you can't win the war till you get out of the foxhole, and he discharged me, and I went back to my AA group, the downtown group in Montgomery, and I found me a sponsor. And I don't know how I found him, and he doesn't know how he found me. But we just got together, and this guy was 65 years old, blind in one eye, living in a halfway house, and had a 6th grade education. Definitely not my kind of people, you know. And somehow we got together and developed a rapport and a relationship far stronger than my relationship with Julie or my daddy or anybody else. And you know, that old boy, Big Tom, was in his 16th year of sobriety in this program, and all of y'all know that's a very dangerous year. And a craving was flung on him to go to a meeting every night, and he wanted me to drive him. And single-handedly, I got that man through that 16th dangerous year. And at the end of it, he came up one night at a meeting and he gave me this silver dollar because I didn't know it. But one day at a time, I'd stayed sober myself. I got my family back. I started working the program the way you taught it to me and really getting involved in it. You know, they talk about being off the sauce. They talk about being on the wagon. But you talk about being in AA, like a coffee in a cup, surrounded. And that's the way they taught me to work the program. And I didn't argue with anything, and I didn't intellectualize those silly slogans on the wall. In fact, I want to point this out right now because Dick did it last night too. I looked at that one day at a time thing, and that bothered me because I was taught to project and budget and everything. And I said, how can a man live one day at a time? And I thought it was something unique and something new. But it dawned on me later then and later on that one day at a time is one of the great principles that have been passed to mankind throughout history. How did God create the world? One day at a time. The children of Israel wandering in the wilderness, how did He provide for them? One day at a time. They wanted to save up that manna for a while, and it wouldn't even work. It couldn't save up, you know. And when we close this meeting tonight and we join hands and pray the Lord's Prayer, what do we say? We say, give us this day our daily bread. We don't ask for a whole year's supply or inventory, you know. And when that dawned on me, and then when later on that I found out that the carpenter sat on the mountain and he said something to the effect that sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof, and I looked it up in the Living Bible, and it said right there in the Sermon on the Mount, it said, live one day at a time. And that's a keynote to our program, and I bought it. I want to share one last little thing with you before I close, because it means an awful lot to me, and it means what we're doing here this weekend. Anonymity is a spiritual foundation. There's a lot of ways to look at anonymity, but you can find a little bitty article stuck at the back of that book called AA Comes of Age that Bill wrote. And the key to it, the way he sees it there, is anonymity is total sacrifice. If we don't identify self, we can't start taking credit for what self does. So anonymity throughout our program is the way we sacrifice. And we sacrifice in helping others. And a story was told that I enjoy so much that really points out what we do here. You know, over in the Middle East there's this most unique part of the entire world. Geologically and geographically, it is unlike anywhere else on this earth. There's the River Jordan Valley that goes down and it flows through, and right on its rocky shores is where the carpenter did his thing, and it flows into the Sea of Galilee that everybody's familiar with, and it teems with life and beauty and abundance, and people fish there, and it's beautiful. But that same river flows right on down the same valley into the most unique place in the world, the Dead Sea. And it is the lowest place on this earth, and it is totally, almost sterile. It's so dead because of the salt and chemical content. But the same river feeds both of them. The only difference in that situation is that the Sea of Galilee takes everything that the river gives it, and it uses it, and then it gives it up in kind. And the Dead Sea just grabs it and holds on to it and doesn't give up nothing, and it dies and stagnates and quits. Our program's like that. You've got to get it first, and then in order to keep it, you've got to give it away. And I think that is what we're doing here this weekend, and it's so wonderful. You know, I want to close by telling you this. I believe that a weekend like this, not just this one, because there are others in other AA conferences and whatnot, and there are AA meetings all over the place. But I believe when that same carpenter stood on the mountain and talked to the multitude, and when he said, I have come that ye might have life and have it more abundantly, he was talking about just what we have found right here. Thank you.